friends, the time has finally come. We are diving into the #1 classic of the fantasy genre. One might even call it the birth of the fantasy genre, The Lord of the Rings. So, confession time. Wow, that was too intense. This is actually the first time for me reading this trilogy. Shameful, I know. How I can even call myself a fantasy fan, I do not know. So my plan for this is to make not 1, but 3 videos, starting of course with Fellowship of the Ring. As usual, I will start by doing a detailed plot summary before moving on to the discussion. I have listed all the timestamps below should you wish to jump around. Also, I am kind of expecting that anyone watching this video will already be somewhat familiar with the story and the world, so I won't be explaining all of that or every single thing in too much detail, otherwise this video will be 3 hours long. With that being said, why don't you make yourself comfortable with a nice cup of tea or any other beverage of your choice, and let's get into it. Contrary to what is considered good form in fantasy nowadays, The Fellowship of the Ring starts off with a history lesson about hobbits that goes on for 28 pages. It is baffling, and if you want to hear more about that, I suggest you stick around for the discussion part of this video. The first chapter of the story starts at page 29, and we are introduced to Bilbo and Frodo Baggins. Bilbo is a wealthy relative of Frodo's, who adopted him at a young age, and for some reason they share the same birthday. And they have a big birthday coming up. Bilbo is turning 111 and Frodo is turning 33, which is the coming of age for hobbits. So they're planning a huge party and there's a lot of excitement about the big day. Bilbo's old friend Gandalf has travelled to the Shire to participate. Gandalf is a wizard and he's brought a lot of fireworks, which the hobbits really enjoy. So we're at the party and everyone is having a merry time, and it is time for Bilbo to give a speech. You okay? He thanks everyone for being there, etc., etc., but then he gets cryptic and he finishes off by saying goodbye, and then he vanishes on the spot. There was a lot of confusion among the guests at this, but then it was generally agreed that the joke was in very bad taste and more food and drink were needed to cure the guests of shock and annoyance. To be fair, that is exactly how I would react if I attended a party and the host just vanished in front of my eyes. Next, we have Bilbo and Gandalf back at his hobbit hole mansion, Bag End, where Bilbo is preparing for his departure. He is leaving the Shire for good to go and live out the rest of his days with the elves in Rivendell. He's leaving everything to Frodo, his house as well as another, more precious possession, his magic ring that makes you invisible when you wear it. But Bilbo struggles to let go of the ring and needs some help from Gandalf to leave it behind. As he finally does so, he gets relieved and sets off on his departure along with 3 unnamed dwarves who had just been chilling out in other rooms this whole time. The story perspective now shifts to Frodo, who has a lot to deal with after Bilbo's departure, especially after that curious vanishing act he did at the party. His house is full of visitors who have apparently decided to loot him, some even starting to dig a hole through the wall in the cellar because they heard a rumor about some hidden treasure there. Hobbits are just delightfully weird. Before leaving the Shire, Gandalf also stops by Frodo to warn him about keeping the ring secret and safe. Then we start fast-forwarding quite a lot. Year after year, Frodo keeps throwing big birthday parties in honor of Bilbo, and the hobbits find him weird for not settling down. He mostly just takes lonely walks in the Shire and spends time with his friends Merry and Pippin, and he often regrets not going with Bilbo on his last trip to Rivendell. Years go by and Frodo's 50th birthday is approaching. Around this time, strange rumors have now reached the Shire, rumors of a tower in the dark land of Mordor being rebuilt. You're kind of ruining the moment now, Niles. This is when Gandalf returns to Frodo with ominous tidings. He tells Frodo everything that there is to know about the ring. It is literally a very drawn-out conversation about all the rings of power. And it is surprisingly calm as well. It's just a casual afternoon chat in the parlor. They can even hear Sam the gardener doing gardening outside the window. Gandalf had his suspicions that Bilbo's ring is the actual ring of power made by the Dark Lord Sauron. He asks Frodo to put the ring into the fireplace, and sure enough, an inscription appears in glowing letters, saying, "One ring to rule them all, one ring to find them, one ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them." A very intense inscription to put on your jewelry. We learn that Sauron is searching for his ring, as without it he cannot regain his full strength and power. So Frodo starts talking about getting rid of the ring somehow. Gandalf then tells him that only in the fires of Orodruin can the ring be destroyed. He means Mount Doom in Mordor, but in Middle-earth every single location has like at least 3 different names that are all used differently depending on who speaks. Just to make it a little less confusing, you know. It is decided that Frodo's identity is no longer safe as the enemy knows that he has the ring, so he must leave the Shire. They realize that Sam the gardener has been listening in on their conversation, and Gandalf confronts him and tells him that he'll have to go with Frodo. Poor Sam was just gardening one afternoon, and all of a sudden he gets pulled into this super dangerous mission to the other side of the world. Long story short, Frodo finally leaves the Shire along with Sam and Pippin, as his other friend Merry is already waiting at their first location, which is a neighboring area called Buckland. Gandalf was supposed to join for this, but had ghosted them for some reason. As they are traveling through the Shire, they encounter a mysterious black rider, referring to the color of the horse and his clothes, not the skin color of the person. This rider seems to be searching for them, and they were really creeped out by him in general. After spending a night in the wild, they reach the borders of the Shire, where they're invited to dinner by Farmer Maggot. There's just a lot of meandering here, but I just assume that's because they're hobbits and could never pass on a good meal, even when they're out on a secret and dangerous mission. They finally cross the Brandywine River and enter Buckland, where they stay with Merry at a house that Frodo had purchased as a diversion, so that people would simply think that he just moved to another area, because hobbits are very gossipy creatures, apparently. After another dinner party, they decide to continue the journey through the Old Forest, as the roads will be watched by these mysterious Black Riders. So the next morning, Frodo, Sam, Merry and Pippin set off into the Old Forest, which is a very eerie place, and they don't like it much. After a long hike, they eventually stop and rest, and fall asleep at the base of a great willow. But this wasn't a very friendly tree. Sam is the only one to snap out of his sleepiness and just manages to save Frodo from being drowned by a tree root. And Merry and Pippin are being dragged under by several roots. Frodo is very dramatic here and basically just runs around crying for help. And enter Tom Bombadil. This man just comes along singing and saves them from the unfriendly tree and then brings them back to his house for, you guessed it, a dinner party. The hobbits stay with Tom Bombadil and his wife Goldberry for a few days. Bombadil is a curious character. You get the impression that he's some sort of divine creature, but he's commonly just referred to as the eldest. But for this story in particular, he doesn't really serve a purpose, so let's move on. The hobbits then continue their journey through the Barrow Downs, an area close to the Old Forest full of old burial mounds. It is also an eerie place that they wish to cross as quickly as possible, but of course they accidentally fall asleep again when they stop to rest. And when they wake up, they are surrounded by fog and darkness is quickly upon them. So naturally, they get abducted by some wights and are held inside a barrow. For some reason, they're all in their underwear and covered in treasure. Frodo then starts to sing to call Tom Bombadil to their aid, and he hears him and comes to save them. Once outside, Tom says he'll go and look for their ponies, and while they wait, they should just run around naked in the grass. And they're just like, okay. So they do that. Once they have their ponies back, Tom advises them to continue down to the village of Bree and get a room at the Prancing Pony Inn. So now, because we are entering a new area, we are treated to a lovely history lesson about Bree, its inhabitants, and the surrounding settlements of the area. Because why not? Frodo and the others get a room at the Prancing Pony, and we meet the innkeeper, Barliman Butterbur, who invites them to socialize in the common room after supper. There are a lot of different people there, both men, hobbits, and dwarves, and among them is a mysterious-looking man in a dark corner. He looks quite rugged, and he seems to be observing Frodo. So Pippin gets a little drunk and starts telling everyone stories of Bilbo, and this is when the rugged man signals to Frodo to come and speak to him. He introduces himself as Strider, and he warns Frodo about some strange folk moving around Bree lately, hinting at Pippin being a bit careless with his stories. Frodo then decides that he should try and stop Pippin from revealing too much. But he can't just go up to him and tell him quietly that they should retreat for the night. No! Instead, he gets up on a table and sings a song that lasts for 2 pages, and then he falls off the table and accidentally slips the ring onto his finger. And of course he vanishes, causing a lot of confusion. After all the commotion dies down, Strider gives Frodo a scolding for his stupidity. And rightfully so. He reveals that he knows his true identity and offers to help them. There is a very convoluted exchange here with Barliman Butterbur, the innkeeper, on Strider's own identity. Apparently, Gandalf had been at the Prancing Pony 3 months prior, leaving a letter with Butterbur asking him to send it to Frodo in the Shire. But then he forgot to actually send the letter and hands it to Frodo here instead. The letter explains that Strider is Aragorn and that they can trust him. What a lucky thing that that letter appeared just at that moment. At that point, the Black Riders have now reached Bree and the danger is becoming more apparent. That night, Frodo and the gang sleep in the parlour as suggested by Strider, i.e. Aragorn. And good thing too, since the Black Riders ransacked the Hobbit rooms at the inn that night, expecting to find them there. So it is definitely high time to get out of Bree. Unfortunately though, the Black Riders had released their ponies from the inn stables, so now they have no ponies, and we spend quite some time pondering over this issue. In the end, they managed to buy 1 pony from a local thug who demanded 3 times more than what it was worth. Yeah, so Aragorn and the hobbits are now off on foot. They travel for about 5 days through marshland to avoid the open road, during which the hobbits complained a lot and were generally miserable. Eventually they reach Weathertop, which are the ruins of an ancient watchtower. We make camp here in a sheltered area and we learn that there's an additional 14 days journey to reach Rivendell. Unfortunately though, the Black Riders had also reached Weathertop and were now closing in on them. Frodo was overcome with terror and suddenly felt a strong urge to put on the ring. He does so, and he can see one of the riders advance on him, and the rider manages to stab Frodo in the shoulder before Aragorn chases them off with burning branches. So Frodo is now wounded, and Aragorn does his best to heal him, but it's difficult since he was stabbed with a cursed blade. They really had to hurry to get to Rivendell now. The arduous journey through the wilderness continues for several more days as Frodo grows weaker. Eventually, they run into an elf on the road. His name is Glorfindel, and he had been sent out by Lord Elrond to meet with them. He puts Frodo onto his own horse, as Frodo is now barely conscious. They continue for a while, but the Black Riders, also called the Nazgul by the way, caught up with them at the ford of Bruinen. Glorfindel urged his horse to get away with Frodo, and the Black Riders followed. As they were upon him, the water of the ford rose up and causing a great flood that carried away the Nazgul. After this, Frodo loses consciousness, and when he wakes up, he's in a nice, comfy bed, and next to his bedside is none other than Gandalf. They do some catching up, and we learn that Gandalf was actually held captive, and that was why he was unable to meet up with Frodo at the start of the journey. They are now in Rivendell, and a great feast had been prepared in their honor. Frodo was seated next to the dwarf Gloin, who turned out to be very chatty. He also sees Elrond for the first time, as well as Elrond's beautiful daughter Arwen. After the feast, Frodo meets up with Bilbo. They do some catching up, and Bilbo asks to see the ring. Frodo shows it to him reluctantly, and when he does so, he felt like a shadow fell between them. And Bilbo suddenly looked like a hungry, wrinkled creature. Bilbo then composes himself and apologizes, and then the night moves on for many more pages without anything important happening. Then we get to the most dreaded chapter in the whole book for me, the Council of Elrond. Lasting around 30 pages, we are told numerous backstories, introduced to a lot of new characters, as well as given the next quest objective. The first step had been to get the ring to Rivendell, and now it is decided that the ring must be taken to Mordor, where it can finally be destroyed. Oh, and we also learn that Aragorn, aka Strider, is the actual heir of Isildur, King of Gondor, the man who initially cut the ring off from Sauron's hand a couple of thousand years ago. Frodo offers to be the one to take the ring into the fires of Mount Doom, and Elrond decides that Sam should go with him. Again, poor Sam. Nothing else is decided, however, and scouts are sent out to find out what happened to the Nazgul. For 2 months, Frodo and the gang are just chilling in Rivendell, awaiting the return of the scouts. Once they do return and have no concrete news at all, it is for some reason decided that this is the perfect time for the ring to leave Rivendell. So the Fellowship is now properly formed, consisting of Frodo, Gandalf, Aragorn, Boromir, Legolas, Gimli, Merry, and Pippin. I am assuming that you all know who all these people are, otherwise I would sit here all day. Before they depart, Bilbo gives Frodo a significant gift. It's a kind of chainmail shirt made of an incredibly hard metal called mithril, which he told him to keep a secret. So, the Fellowship has now left Rivendell and started their journey. Gandalf had planned for them to cross over a mountain pass called Caradhras and stay out of sight, but it doesn't take long for them to run into some Crebain, a kind of bird spy. Fearing detection, they continue up the mountain pass, but are soon overwhelmed by snowstorms. Eventually, they admitted themselves defeated and had to turn back, being forced to take another path, a more dark and sinister path to the other side. Or at least after quite a few pages of discussions on the subject. So they make for Moria, but not before getting attacked by wolves in the night. Gandalf did his best threatening the wolves, but when that didn't work, Legolas had to shoot an arrow at the pack leader, causing them to flee. But then they were replaced by wargs, and this time everyone in the company had to draw their weapons until Gandalf summoned enough wizard's fire to scare them off. So then they reach the walls of Moria, and they round the dark and gloomy lake before it, looking for the entrance. Gandalf tells Sam to free the pony, as he will not be able to join through the long dark of Moria. Sam bursts into tears, but eventually does as he's told. They spend a bit of time finding the door, and once they do find it, they spend some more time trying to figure out how to open it. Boromir gets flustered as they wait and throws a stone into the black lake, causing an ominous rippling in the water. At that moment, Gandalf figured out the riddle to open the door. Then they were attacked by a gigantic creature from the dark lake with 20+ tentacles. It grabbed hold of Frodo's ankle and pulled him towards the lake. So the pony gets spooked and starts to run off, causing Sam to run after him, but then he heard Frodo scream, so he runs back again, weeping and cursing to help him. For some reason, everyone else is completely frozen at the sight of all this. So Sam came running to save him, slashing at the tentacle with his knife until it let go of Frodo's leg. Then they all hurried through the entrance and the tentacles followed, causing the entrance to crumble. There was now no other choice but to brave the long darkness to the other side. So they start their journey in the dark. At one point, Pippin gets curious and drops a stone down a pit, and it was a good while before he heard it hit the bottom. Gandalf got angry, said that this is a serious journey, not some hobbit walking party. Shortly after this, they start hearing some distant tapping noises, but they soon die out again. This first part of the journey went on quite uneventfully. By the second night, the company take rest in a great dark hall. Gandalf tells them that the wealth of Moria was mithril, a silver-like metal that was harder than tempered steel and incredibly valuable. Frodo is quietly reminded of the mithril shirt that Bilbo gave him before their departure, but decides not to tell any of the others about it. The next morning, they find a chamber with a tomb inside, the final resting place of the dwarf Balin. They learn that the last expedition to try and reclaim Moria had met a gruesome end in that chamber. Just at that moment, they hear drums outside, as well as the echoes of many enemies. Gandalf took a quick look and saw both orcs, Uruk-hai, as well as a cave troll. The company fought valiantly, and many orcs fell, until the orc chieftain arrives and throws his spear right at Frodo, who collapses from the force of the thrust. Eventually, they flee the chamber and continue down some stairs, Aragorn carrying Frodo and Gandalf taking a moment to magically seal the passage behind them. Frodo says that he is okay and he can walk himself, and everyone is amazed that he's still alive and even unharmed. Once Gandalf is caught up with them, he makes some remark about there being more to Frodo than meets the eye, just like with Bilbo. He also says that some unknown force tried to get through his spell before, and that they almost succeeded, which had made him really shaken up. They continue until they reach another great hall, and finally the bridge of Khazad-dûm is near. Hundreds of orcs were in pursuit, shooting arrows at them as they ran for the bridge. Suddenly, the orcs fled, and a great dark figure appeared behind them. Everyone is frozen by fear. It is a Balrog, a great and powerful creature from the darkest depths of Moria. Streaming with fire and shadow, the creature held a great whip and charged towards them. The company hurries across the narrow bridge, but Gandalf remained in the middle, raising his sword and staff while casting a spell to keep the Balrog from passing. There was a great white flame erupting as the staff broke into pieces and the bridge collapsed under the Balrog's feet. Wielding its whip, the Balrog caught on to Gandalf and pulled him down into the dark chasm with it. The company runs towards the exit, Aragorn now taking the lead, until they finally reach the light and the gates of Moria were far behind them. Struck by grief over the loss of Gandalf, they hike for many hours until they could finally stop and rest. Aragorn insists on examining Frodo for injuries and discovers the mithril shirt underneath his clothes. Everyone marvels at the magnificence of it, and Aragorn tells him not to take it off until the quest is over. After their rest, they continue towards the border of Lothlorien, also called the Golden Wood. They rest by a stream called Nimrodel, and Legolas sings a song about the elf maiden from which the stream was named. Then they meet Haldir, an elf of Lothlorien, who offers them refuge for the night in the treetops. Frodo wakes up in the middle of the night, feeling a presence climbing the tree that they were sleeping in. He had just glimpsed the creature before it disappeared, and Haldir came up again, saying that he saw it too, but he had no idea what it was. He also warned Frodo about a strong company of orcs now marching through the forest. The next day, Haldir leads them further into Lothlorien to meet with the Lord and Lady. There is quite a bit of drama when he required Gimli to be blindfolded but no one else, which Gimli refused. So Aragorn decides that everyone should be blindfolded to make him shut up and do as he's told. Eventually they arrive in the city of Caras Galadhon and are taken to meet with Lord Celeborn and Lady Galadriel. They tell them about what happened to Gandalf in Moria, and Galadriel invites them to stay in Lothlorien for a while to rest. Many days pass of them just eating, sleeping, and walking around among the trees. One night, as Frodo and Sam are out walking, Galadriel beckons them to her garden, where she offers them a glimpse into her mirror, which is a kind of enchanted basin of water. Sam looks into the mirror first and gets a bit flustered as he can see his neighbor Ted Sandyman pulling up trees that shouldn't be pulled up. As Frodo looks into it, however, he sees many visions before the mirror just went dark, showing only a single eye that kept growing larger and pulling him towards it. So he then pulls away from the mirror and offers the ring to Galadriel. She is greatly tempted to accept it, but ultimately passes the test and declines. The company is now preparing to leave Lothlorien and continue the journey south. They were given many gifts as they departed, such as food and clothing. Frodo was also given a crystal vial with water from Galadriel's fountain, and in it was the light of the star Erendil, which would give him light even in the darkest of places. The company now set off in boats along the river Anduin, traveling for several days, continuing south. One night, Sam sees a pair of eyes in the dark hiding behind a log in the water. He and Frodo come to the conclusion that it must be Gollum and that he must have been following them since Moria. Aragorn later confirms this, saying that he's tried to capture him several times at that point, but he's very elusive. About a week since they set off along the river, they are attacked by orcs shooting arrows at them from the eastern shore, forcing them to stay closer to the western riverbank. Continuing on, they pass these great stone statues called the Argonath, depicting great kings Isildur and Anarion, which are Aragorn's ancestors. Shortly afterwards, they are forced to stop as the river ended in a great waterfall. They now had the choice between going east or west, both options bringing great danger. Aragorn looked to Frodo to decide, and Frodo asks for an hour to think it over and walks off. After a while, he finds that Boromir has followed him. He expressed a wish to talk to Frodo, that maybe they could find wisdom together. He urges Frodo to bring the ring to Minas Tirith for safekeeping, but Frodo refuses to divert from the mission to destroy it. Boromir gets increasingly angry and eventually tries to take the ring from Frodo, who panics and puts on the ring to get away from him. Boromir then returns to the company, who has now grown worried about Frodo, so they set off in different directions to try and find him. As Sam lags behind Aragorn, he gets a sudden realization and runs back towards the boats, where he catches Frodo just about to leave. He throws himself into the water after him and insisting to come with him to Mordor. And the two set off together, leaving the others behind. And this is where the Fellowship of the Ring ends. So, that was an interesting ride. Sometimes it was intense and entertaining, and other times it was a little bit like a lecture. But honestly, I thoroughly enjoyed myself reading this, even though I like to make fun of it in some places. It really is such a wonderful story, and I can't wait to get through books 2 and 3 of this epic fantasy adventure. So the writing style is really quirky and whimsical, especially in the beginning when they're still in the Shire. There's something subtle about the humor that really appeals to me as well. But of course, it's not without its problems, and my biggest issue with it would probably be the pacing. There are some very slow parts in this, while others just fly by super quickly. But more on that later. Another thing that was a little disappointing was that there were so many characters that the majority of them ended up feeling somewhat hollow. They simply don't get enough page time to make a proper impression. The one exception to this would actually be the hobbits. We spend so much time with them compared to the others that they actually stand out fairly well. Which leads me to my first discussion point. I was actually surprised at how much I would come to dislike Frodo as the main character. By this point, it has basically become a meme that the true hero of the story is actually Sam, while Frodo does nothing but complain. And I'm sure this will become more apparent in books 2 and 3. For instance, take the situations where the hobbits are lulled to sleep in the old forest and nearly killed by the willow tree. Sam is the only one who manages to shake off the daze and saves Frodo, and as soon as Frodo comes to, he immediately gets dramatic, says that they should never have left Buckland, and just runs around screaming, "Help, help, help!" I mean, that is exactly how I would react in a situation like this, but I digress. There are just so many situations like this throughout the book that as a reader, you get the impression that Frodo just lacks agency. Even though I know that the ring has power over him, as it does over everyone else, and it's really tricky to write a character that is both courageous while also being constantly put into situations where he has to be saved by other people. He just ends up feeling like a weakling, for lack of a better word. And it's not because he's a hobbit, because I don't have that impression of any of the other hobbits. For example, Merry and Pippin feel like fairly strong-minded characters, even though Pippin is most certainly the stupid one of the group, while Merry has a bit more sense. And then we have Sam. I believe it is time for a little segment I'd like to call Samwise the Sassy. To be fair, Sam has a little bit of a rough start. He doesn't really feel like his own character at first, giving off really strong Hodor vibes, if anything. But then, as they leave Bree, Sam did a complete 180 and suddenly became super sassy. For example, as they are leaving Bree, the thug, Bill Fernie, who sold them the pony, makes some rude remarks, and Sam just looks at him and says, "And you, Fernie, get your ugly face out of sight or it will get hurt." And then he throws an apple at him. Another example is when the company is climbing the mountain pass of Caradhras, and Aragorn says that they will have to rest before continuing. And Sam just mutters, "Shelter? If this is shelter, then no wall and no roof make a house." That wasn't actually supposed to be funny, but just that fact makes it funny. Don't ask me how that works. You can just always trust Sam to have some sassy one-liners, and I love him for it. So, if I was to rank my top 3 favorite characters so far, the ranking would be number 1, Sam, for obvious reasons. Number 2, Gandalf, simply for that Hobbit walking party line, as well as that time when he threatened a pack of common wolves. And number 3, I would put Pippin here because I enjoy his stupidity, but then he did that thing with the rock in Moria which I can't forgive him for. So I think we'll put Aragorn here for now. He is quite austere, but also determined and calm, which are suitable traits for him, I think. Like I said before, the characters overall didn't feel very fleshed out, but I'm hoping to make better sense of them as I continue through books 2 and 3. So now, let's circle back to that prologue, shall we? The prologue manages to be equally as dull as it is entertaining. The first part of this, because it is split into 5, is called Concerning Hobbits and recounts the history of the hobbits, their various breeds, skills, culture, appearance, migration patterns, what colors they like, that they do not like machines but are pretty good with tools, as well as the history of the Shire. Part 2, concerning pipeweed, because that is a history all on its own. Part 3 talks about the politics and government of the Shire, and Part 4 is a recap of how Bilbo found the ring on his adventure with the dwarves. And then there is one final section about how the Shire keep their records. All of this before the story even starts. That is the tricky thing about genre fiction, in this case fantasy. World building is mandatory. It really is. And as I began writing fantasy myself, I realized just how difficult it is to balance world building into your writing. You have to explain to some extent how the world works in order for the reader to fully understand what happens in the story. In fantasy writing, we have this general rule of thumb: beware of infodumps. Explain the world building through scenes, dialogue and behavior of the characters, descriptions and so on, but infodumps are completely forbidden. The funny thing is, this rule didn't exist when Tolkien wrote these books. He was free to do things however he wanted, and he did not hold back. The prologue isn't the only infodump, so even if you skipped that, you will keep running into them. I think, however, that in the case of The Lord of the Rings, I actually don't mind them that much. In a way, I would say that the extensive world building here is the reason why this story has become so iconic. Because with world building comes immersion, and immersion is the best achievement a fantasy writer could possibly have. Just think about it for a second. You have written this huge fantasy world and story, but if you fail to make it immersive, then the reader won't gain anything from the experience. That is why my view is so split here. I love Middle-earth, and I love the lore of this world. But then on the other hand, I'm also just a reader who wants to be entertained. I'm interested to know what people think about this, so please share your thoughts in the comments. So pacing. It is such a boring technical word, isn't it? What even is pacing? For those of you who don't know, here's how you can recognize bad pacing. You get bored and want to put away the book. And seriously, 9 times out of 10, that's usually the main culprit. Because it drags, and some scenes or narration just go on and on and on, seemingly without reason. You'll find a lot of situations like that in Fellowship. You can tell that Tolkien had way too much fun writing about the hobbits in the Shire, because it takes the book 100 pages to actually leave the Shire. And in a book that's 423 pages in total, you can see how that's not necessarily a good balance. Don't get me wrong though, I love the Shire. If there was one location in any fantasy world where I would happily settle down forever, it would be in the Shire. But it does make for a slow start in an epic fantasy adventure. Things do pick up quite a lot after the Fellowship leaves Things do pick up quite a lot after the Fellowship leaves Rivendell, but that's not until page 294. And it's not just the actual page time spent in a certain place in the story, but even something exciting can feel dull if the pacing is off. For instance, every single time a decision has to be made about something, we are told the entire process of the various characters reaching that decision. Every argument, every time someone needs to sleep on it, then all of a sudden it's the next day and the same conversation resumes and goes on for several more pages. Or other times the narrative just diverts in odd directions for no apparent reason. Like when the hobbits leave Bree with Aragorn, we are told an account of what happened to the ponies that the Nazgul let out from the inn stables. But don't worry, they apparently had a very nice life once they got back to Balin and Butterbird, the prancing pony. As a reader, I feel like there is no need to see every single discussion on how a decision is made, or just every single step a character takes on their journey. Every now and then, sure, especially if it's something important that brings high stakes, but every single time just makes for a bit of a dull read. I mean, even when we already know the outcome of the discussion, we are still given the whole account of how they got to that point. For example, when the mountain pass of Caradhras failed them and they had to retreat, Gandalf and the others debate for a long time about whether or not to take the road through the mines of Moria. But this chapter is named A Journey Through the Dark, so the reader already knows that they will end up going there. So that just makes this entire discussion quite redundant. That being said, I still think Tolkien was an excellent writer, and even though the book has its flaws, it's still really good. And that is a feat in itself, especially when you remember that this is basically the first ever epic fantasy saga. Tolkien had no classics or bestsellers to compare his work with, no tropes or cliches to research. Well, I suppose he did have his friend and critique partner C.S. Lewis, but that's about it. Tolkien just wrote what he himself wanted to read, and this was the result. And I just think that's really amazing. So, I thought I would leave this discussion here, as I am sure I will find many more points to add to it once I read The Two Towers and The Return of the King. Now, I'm curious to know whether you have read Fellowship of the Ring, and of course what your thoughts are, as always. Please share them in the comments below. And while you're at it, please make sure to leave a like and subscribe if you really want to make my day. Now I will get on to reading The Two Towers and hopefully get that out for you as soon as possible. Thank you all so much for watching today, and I hope to see you back next time.